So I guess this is the last class, or the last, yeah, and then next week you get to do a final. It's just wonderful. It's the final is Tuesday at 10:15 for 2 hours. There'll be 75 questions. 50 will be from the last test on, and then 25 for the whole semester. And then there'll be extra credit. There's one lecture that I haven't, so obviously organisms live in an environment of some sort or another, and they have to respond to it. Single-cell organisms, whether they're bacteria or eukaryote single-cell organisms, obviously respond to their environment, usually in terms of chemicals and chemistry. And also they can deal with temperature, just like an environment anywhere, right? It's a matter of ecology. So bacteria and a lot of single-cell things use chemotaxis, it's called, responding to chemicals. Now, just so you know, we also respond to that kind of stuff too. Plants also respond to what's called phototaxis in terms of light from the sun. And then the only organisms, though, that actually have a system involving a nervous system are animals. And animals, well, except for sponges. Sponges don't have a nervous system, but everything else has at least what's called a neural net. And it's all based on neurons, which are the primary kinds of cells that are involved in nervous systems. Okay. Now, in terms of our cells, or in terms of, let's say, vertebrates, or, well, we'll start with that. We have a central nervous system that's composed of the brain and then the spinal cord. And then branching off from the spinal cord, we have neurons that go all throughout our body. In some places, there are more neurons than others. So if you were to count the number of neurons in our fingertips, there'd be many, many more than, let's say, compared to a small spot on the skin of your back. Okay? Because we use our fingers a lot, and we have to be able to sense things with kind of a fine grain. Now, there are a lot of neurons where there's something called the reflex. Obviously, you've all kind of experienced it. Let's say you go to the doctor and they pound your knee and your leg jerks up. Or this person who's coming in right now is a monster. And he's going to eat you and you're going to be startled. That's a reflex too. You don't have to think about, in terms of a reflex, you don't have to think about it. and it initiates a flight or fight response. If you had to think about it, it would probably mean that it takes too long to do that and you wouldn't respond appropriately quickly enough. Okay, so there are parts of the nervous system that are strictly a reflex sort of thing. Now, if we look at different kinds of neurons, we have sensory neurons. So we have sensory neurons for vision, for hearing, for smell, for taste, and for touch. We actually even have an ability, at least some people do, to almost have something like bat sonar, but most people never experience it, only those that, let's say, are blind from an early age. So, but in general, we have 5 senses. There are other animals that have additional senses, like I mentioned, bats, and marine mammals like whales and such. So, in terms of the nervous system and the different kinds of neurons, we have these sensory neurons that receive signals. Now, we also have interneurons that carry those signals from the sensory neurons to motor neurons. At least, I hope that's what's happening with most of you. Otherwise, you're probably off in some never land. And they also carry those signals to the central nervous system, to the brain. And then the interneurons are also connected to what are called motor neurons. And motor neurons are connected to what are called effectors, whether it's muscle cells or cells from different organs, all that kind of stuff. So, let's say you go and reach into an oven and forget to wear padding, and you touch something that's really hot. So that's the reflex as well. You have these neurons in your fingertips. Pain carried to the muscles that immediately take your hand away so it doesn't just sit there getting burned. There are actually some people who have a genetic condition where they actually don't feel pain. It's actually a really dangerous condition because we kind of need that when we're, kind of walking through the world. There's all kinds of things that are dangerous, and we want to be able to respond to them quickly. The reflex, right, there's reaction to unexpected stimuli, salivation, so we smell something, let's say. We start salivating immediately. We don't have to think about salivating. There might be a gag response, let's say. We put something that's distasteful into our mouth, something like that. So all of these things don't require what's called cognitive processing. Cognition is responding in some way to the environment that requires you to actually learn about it and then respond appropriately. So we have all these different cognitive systems. We have a visual system. We have a fear response is very common, is part of the system. All of these are cognitive sort of things. Of course, there's also memorization, thinking, all that. Okay, so neurons direct behavior. In terms of our central nervous system, obviously, pretty well protected. Not perfectly protected, so if you bash your head, if there was nothing there, you'd damage your brain. If you bash it hard enough, you would still probably have a bruise on your brain and have a concussion, something like that. And then the spinal cord, that brings all the stuff from the brain to all the other neurons, down through the spinal cord and to the peripheral nervous system, extending all over your body. And then there's some things like the brain stem that handle things you don't have to think about, like your heartbeat, okay? That's the autonomic nervous system. Or breathing. You don't have to think, oh, I have to breathe now, right? You just do it. There's a whole bunch of things like that that our nervous system does without us thinking about it. Okay, so the brain is encased in the skull, which is bone. There is this thin barrier called, well, there's the meninges that surrounds the brain, and then there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from things entering the brain. So, in a lot of cases, our brain is protected from, let's say, pathogens coming in, or drug delivery, things like that. So obviously the brain needs blood. In fact, it requires a tremendous amount of energy. About 20% of all the energy that we use goes towards running our brains, so it's very expensive. And but there's this kind of impermeable part of the capillaries, which are the very smallest blood vessels, that protect us by restricting what can actually get into the brain and what can't. Okay. So there's a lot more parts to the brain than this, but we'll go with this. So the cerebrum is everything that controls language, memory, decision making, all that kind of stuff. There's also a part that does executive function. So we can actually kind of plan things out. It's higher cognition, consciousness. There's a cerebellum that has to do with balance and muscle movement, kind of our motor system. There's other parts of the hypothalamus that controls sex drive, pleasure, pain, hunger. The brainstem is part of that system that deals with things you don't have to think about, like our heartbeat. in terms of, let's say, damage. And this is what they normally use to say that someone is actually dead, is that there's no signals of brain activity at all. Now, they might be brain dead but still alive because, let's say, the brain stem is still working, but that's usually when they pull the plug. There's also situations where a person is in a coma. There's often brain activity, but there's no consciousness. And there's different levels of coma. And a coma is not like being asleep. Okay. So in terms of the structure of a neuron, okay. This is where a signal is coming to from another neuron. Is the dendrite, and it collects neural signals, electrical signals. It's got a whole bunch of receptors for different kinds of chemicals. They're called neurotransmitters. You've probably heard of them, like dopamine and serotonin and things like that. There is also then what's called the axon, and then finally the terminal, at which point the signal is then passed on to another neuron. Now, for a nerve impulse to actually travel from one neuron to the next, it has to have enough of a stimulus to generate that nerve pulse, and it's called action potential. So if it doesn't meet that, it's not going to be carried to the next neuron. When I say that there's electrical potential, it's actually not electricity like you think, perhaps in the form of electrons, but in the form of ions. So these are all various ions. Na is sodium, K is potassium. They have pluses because they've donated their electrons, and so they have fewer electrons than they should. In other words, they have a positive charge versus a negative charge. And there's these channels that then carry the impulse because of these differences in charges. Now, there's more to neural tissue than just neurons. There's also tissue that surrounds the neurons. Along the axon, which is that long central part of the neuron, that's covered in these cells that are called Schwann cells. So if you have a wire, let's say a copper wire, that's carrying electricity, that wire usually has a plastic covering around it so that the wire doesn't touch other wires and electricity doesn't pass across. Well, these Schwann cells are the same sort of thing. They stop leakage of these impulses, and they also protect the cells, the neurons, and they give them sustenance, things like that. Now, Schwann cells are really important. If they're damaged, then you have usually neurological problems. So, multiple sclerosis, that's an autoimmune disease that we've talked about, where the immune system actually attacks part of the brain. Well, it attacks these myelin sheaths made of Schwann cells. And so if you were actually to look at the neurons, you would see that these sheath cells there's spots that are not covering the neurons, or they're completely gone. And so that's why people with multiple sclerosis have what's called neurodegenerative disease. And with these cells gone, the impulses are not carried as quickly, and things slow down, and so that's why you have all these neurological problems. Okay. They've got more, well, for a long time there was nothing anyone could do except to control the immune response with immunosuppressive drugs. Whether it was prednisone or other steroidal compounds, you could suppress the immune system to a certain point so that it reduces the damage. There's some new stuff that's coming on the market, some new drugs that actually can protect these Schwann cells better so that no more damage actually happens. So usually, like with multiple sclerosis, the damage happens over a period of time, and so it gets worse and worse and worse. They're also using something called stem cell therapy, as we mentioned previously. But at this point, it's kind of in the experimental stage with animals. So, as I mentioned, this is the dendrite. The signal comes down along the axon to the terminal. Now, the neurons actually don't touch each other. There's a small gap. It is called the synapse. And it's actually this area here. Space between. So the terminal of one neuron and the dendrite of another are not touching. So you're probably wondering, well, how do the signals get transmitted? And they're actually transmitted by different chemicals that are released from the terminal into the synapse, and then they interact with receptor proteins on the next dendrite. So this is a more detailed picture. Okay. So this is a synapse right here. This is the terminal of the previous cell. And then down here are these receptors from the dendrite. There's these vesicles called, well, they're vesicles. They're little things that actually contain neurotransmitters. They move through the neuron, and then when they get to the edge, they actually release those neurotransmitters into the synapse. Okay, and then, so these are this presynaptic neurons. On the other side are the dendrites, which are the postsynaptic proteins. And as the neurotransmitters are into the synapse, they then actually come to these receptors and bind to them. And that's how the impulse is actually propagated from one neuron to the next. Now, there are supposed to be, let's see, there's a proper concentration of a neurotransmitter in the synapse. Once it reaches that concentration, there are other neurotransmitters that haven't been bound to the receptors. They're just floating there. And so they're actually taken back up into the terminal and to the vesicles. Also, once the impulse has been propagated, they're released, and they're they're taken back up into the preceding neuron to be either used again or there's digested enzymes. So there's a system where there's not only input of neurotransmitters but removal as well. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of neurotransmitters. Some of them you've probably heard of, like serotonin, dopamine, and then there's all these other ones, acetylcholine, glutamate. What's interesting is some of these neurotransmitters are actually released elsewhere in the body, like serotonin in the gut. And so it turns out the gut actually has a large response. It's connected by other neurons to, of course, the brain and the neurons in the brain. Now, many of the diseases that we have in the brain are the result of neurotransmitter imbalance, such as mental illness, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, those kinds of things. And what we do is, to treat those, we actually oftentimes use drugs that either increase the neurotransmitters in the synapse or decrease. So, like depression, there are usually low serotonin levels of the transmitters in the synapse. And this is usually treated with what are called SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that increase the concentration by not reuptaking neurotransmitters back into the previous neuron. So this is actually what it looks like. These are the drugs in red. And they block those receptors so that as neurotransmitters are released in the synapse, they don't get reuptake or taken back into the cell, and the concentration goes up. And it has an effect for a lot of people of relieving their depression. Now, the trouble is that levels of neurotransmitters are not the same in different parts of the brain. So you use this reuptake inhibitor, and it globs on and blocks those proteins for taking back up neurotransmitters. It does it throughout the brain in the same concentration, but in terms of the brain, there might be more neurotransmitter released, let's say, in the cerebrum, in the frontal cortex, than, let's say, in the cerebellum. So that's why you oftentimes get these side effects that are, it's unfortunate. They still haven't figured out a way to actually control this sort of thing. But these drugs are better than what they used to use. So, but anyway, that's kind of how they work. So drugs that inhibit the uptake of the neurotransmitter, that means the neurotransmitter is in the synapse longer, and it can propagate across to the dendrite neuron. Now, some drugs cause the release of stored neurotransmitters. Others can mimic the neurotransmitters themselves. There are also a lot of drugs that, let's say, illegal drugs that work on the same principle. So, MMDA, ecstasy, the kind of stuff that you guys use when you go to parties and stuff like that, is one of them. LSD is another. There's a whole slew of them that work on the neurotransmitter system, one way or another. They're actually using ecstasy and LSD and other things now in trying to alleviate some of the problems with depression or other mental illnesses. So when you take ecstasy, you usually have this feeling of well-being and of loving everybody around you. It stimulates serotonin release, and then you end up with a depletion of serotonin, and so it has to be resynthesized. So it turns out some drugs are addictive. These drugs are not. LSD, MMDA, or MDMA actually deplete the serotonin, and it actually takes a while for more serotonin to be made in the neuron. So let's say you take LSD, you trip around for 8 or 10 hours, something like that. If you take more, it's not going to have much effect because it's already depleted the serotonin levels in the synapses. Whereas if you take, let's say, an opioid or cannabis, it doesn't work like that. They also deal with different neurotransmitters, but it doesn't, let's say, deplete serotonin like these guys. Now there's another neurotransmitter called dopamine. A lot of people have attention deficit disorder or something like that. Especially in kids, they're kind of bouncing around the room. They don't pay attention. They have a short attention span, and so they actually treat them with something called Ritalin, which actually affects the level of dopamine. Now, I think a lot of these drug treatments are the result of kids being in an environment that they're normally not in, let's say before there were schools and things like that. They were always running around outside. The fact that they couldn't really pay that great of an attention for a long time, well, they were always exploring, and there wasn't really a problem. But nowadays, when kids, they want to actually learn something, and they have to be quiet enough to actually take it in. And so we're using these kinds of drugs. I think in a lot of cases, we're overusing them. Now, there are some kids that really, like Ritalin, really, really helps. But in some cases, it's used kind of like to modify behavior so that you have more of a learning environment in the classroom. Okay, so it blocks or inhibits the reuptake of dopamine, just like things like LSD and MDMA do it for serotonin. The dopamine persists longer in the synapse, and it stimulates neurons that regulate attentiveness. So, in this case, Ritalin, normally reuptake of dopamine limits signaling. And then Ritalin inhibits the uptake, and so you have more propagation across. Now, it turns out that when you do that with the dopamine system, you have higher attentiveness. And so it's a stimulant, and there's a lot of different drugs that work on it, that can work on it. Ritalin is one, but you can also, a lot of the ones that we use for drug abuse, like cocaine or methamphetamine, they have a similar chemical structure. And it inhibits the reuptake of dopamine, higher concentrations, and you have this nice immediate effect. In terms of addiction, a drug is more likely to be addictive if its effects are immediate, euphoric, in other words, so you feel great. Let's say you do ecstasy. Well, no, let's say you do an opioid or something, and then of relatively short duration, and then to get that high again, you need more of the same stuff. There's all kinds of drugs that actually have this effect. Cigarettes and nicotine, that's a stimulant, highly addictive. It's a stimulant, so you get a little bit of a, you could get a buzz. And in fact, there's some wild tobacco in South America that has very high concentrations. And they smoke it, and they actually get a real kind of high. There's also opioids, of course, in the crisis that we're in now. And usually what happens is you start out, you get a high, but if you keep using it over time, your body, the neurons adapt to it. And just to maintain kind of like feeling all right, you need more and more of the opiate. And then some drugs like opioids are capable of inducing a tolerance effect, like you get less of an effect. And if you don't have it, those drugs in the system, you get withdrawal symptoms. Alcohol is also an addictive drug. So methamphetamine, decreases the number of dopamine receptors over time. In other words, the receptors on the dendrites that accept the dopamine neurotransmitter are actually reduced. And so you can have real long-term problems in terms of tolerance. So, in summary, these drugs that alter behavior do so by altering neurotransmitter signaling. When they're used appropriately, these drugs can actually treat a whole bunch of different disorders. But human beings have been using drugs that affect the neurological system for a long time in terms of pleasure. Now, these drugs, by the way, can have a huge effect on people. As you know, I told you earlier in the class that I was once 6'2" with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I was a really kind of vacuous surfer dude. And I experimented, And somehow I got to look like a short little Jewish guy in the process. And that's why I'm looking like this right now. Now, I still served, and I was still very superficial, but obviously it had a huge effect, and I could never get back to, what I was before. So you want to make sure that you perhaps don't use these kinds of drugs, or that might happen to you. Okay? Okay. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about parasites again and how they affect the nervous system, because the nervous system is the basis for our behavior, right? And if you can get an organism to behave in a way that propagates the parasite, so much the better for the parasite in terms of transmission. And a parasite can be anything, a pathogen like bacteria, it can be a eukaryotic parasite, whatever. So one of the things there was something called colony collapse disorder that actually affects that where the bees don't go back to their hive, and they go all over the place and actually infect. They infect all the other bees as well. So actually, okay. So the one I want to really talk about is called Toxoplasma gondii. It's a single-cell eukaryote. It's got different life stages and different hosts. And it can alternate in terms of reproduction between asexual and sexual. Now, the primary host, and the only host that actually where it can reproduce sexually, is in a cat. So cats are usually infected with this. The thing is, other mammals can be infected with toxo. Namely, a lot of rodents. And when rodents are infected, so they're an intermediate host, for sexual reproduction, they have to get back into a cat from this little rodent. Now, animals like these can come into contact with cat feces, things like that, so it gets transmitted that way. But as you know, mice and rats really don't want to be eaten by a cat. And so when there's a cat around, they usually make themselves scarce. The thing is, when they're infected with toxo, they're infected in their brain, and the neurotransmitters in their brain are actually changed, namely dopamine. So rodents, instead of running away from a cat, if they're infected with toxoplasmosis, they oftentimes go and try to hang out with cats. In fact, they actually try to mate with them. And so it's then back in the primary host. Now, it does this by, it carries genes that actually synthesize dopamine. So the parasite itself is synthesizing more and more dopamine, and then change the dopamine levels inside the animals infected. In this case, the rat. And there's a dopamine, increased levels give you a nice sense of well-being. And so the rodents then, instead of being afraid of cats, are actually attracted to them. Even though there's a blood-brain barrier that's there to protect us, Toxo has evolved a system where it can actually get into the brain, even though that barrier is there. Now, Toxo can have a really bad effect if it infects a fetus. So, if someone's pregnant and you have like a cat box, your partner should be the one that changes it and not you, okay? Because you want to make sure that the fetus is not infected with Gondii, and it causes birth defects and all sorts of different things. So I just want you to know, be aware of that. Now, it also infects humans in general, and for a long time it was thought that that it didn't really affect human behavior. Obviously, we're not going to get eaten by a cat, unless it's a tiger or a lion or something like that. So, but we're mammals, and Toxo can actually infect us. Okay. And we can get Toxo from other animals like undercooked pork, things like that. So there's this Czech guy, Czech scientist, and from the former Czechoslovakia, and he noticed what he thought was kind of strange behavior in himself. And so he started looking into this, and he came to the conclusion that T. gondii in fact affects our behavior as well. Now, it's not supposed to. Usually what happens is if we get T. gondii in our brain, we have a system that kind of contains it and keeps it from reproducing in the brain, and so it doesn't really affect us, or that was what was thought. So there was this paper, actually there's been a lot of papers about it now, of how a parasite, in this case, can affect our behavior. There's correlative, but there seem to be specific gender-specific effects. Men tend to be jealous, stubborn, and rule-defiant. Well, they're already that anyway, right? So I don't think that's really changed. Women, warm, outgoing, and moralistic. I don't know about the last part, but it's possible. You see part of yourself in it, don't you? So, but It says here, so the personality of infected men showed lower superego strength and higher vigilance. Thus, the men were more likely to disregard rules. And also, it seems like it might account for men getting in traffic accidents because of road rage. So you can always blame it on toxo for road rage and say it wasn't really me, it was the parasite. Okay. Okay. So back to hypotheses. What are some of the hypotheses that might explain these sorts of behaviors? Well, in terms of the mechanism, it could be just like with the mice. And then, of course, if you really wanted to test it, what you would do is you'd infect some people with toxo and have a control and see if, in fact, there's really a difference. Of course, you can't really do that nowadays. It's considered unethical, right? Which is a shame. I think it would be a pretty cool experiment. Okay. So, in fact, worldwide, up to, in the U.S., perhaps 20% of the population, it might be higher elsewhere. Oh yeah, there's another thing that it does. It's associated with schizophrenia. So it's a correlation, of course, doesn't prove cause and effect, but people who are infected with toxo seem more susceptible to schizophrenia than others. Now, it could be that, like I said, the parasite, if it's in the brain, it can be encapsulated, it doesn't have an effect, but there might be something that releases it from that situation and it starts reproducing asexually and causing behavioral problems. So, let's say stress might induce changes like that. But this is all kind of more speculative. So, let's see. Correlations, people who are infected with P. gondii are more likely to actually act a certain way. Men, risk-taking behavior, that sort of. Or it could be risk-taking behavior the other way around. Now, fortunately, humans aren't infected with cordyceps. At least, it's never been shown that. It's mainly insects, but this ability to affect behavior to increase transmission is really common. There's something called guinea worm in Africa, and when you get infected, you get these sores and they really itch intensely, and the only way to actually kind of get some relief is to go into water. Well, it turns out the parasite has another host, I think it's a snail, in the water, and so it gets transmitted to them, and then every time people go into the water, they get infected or reinfected. So it's affecting their behavior. Another example is like rabies. Rabies infects the nervous system, It's almost always invariably fatal. It's usually passed on from one animal to another by the animal biting another animal. Normally an animal wouldn't do that. And so people, now obviously people aren't biting other people transmitting it, but it still affects their behavior through the nervous system. So, and that's pretty much it.